Mark Glazer, executive editor and publisher of Media Shift. This week we'll be talking about the content marketing boom. Content marketing, also known sometimes as native advertising when it's on publisher sites, includes things like company blogs, ghostwritten articles by CEOs. It's basically proliferating because so many companies are trying to reach out to customers in new ways. Because advertising, the kind of traditional advertising online, isn't working quite as well. There's ad blockers, there's all kinds of reasons. The content marketing is doing well, so we'll be talking about that with our panel, but first, a word from our sponsor. Running your own business requires focus, and so does parenting. Mediatwits podcast sponsor NextSpace created a place where parents could give their best quality of attention to both co-working space and childcare space under one roof. Learn more at nextspace.us/nextkids. And indeed, I am in NextSpace right now, and there's childcare right next door, which is pretty awesome. I want to introduce our panel this week. We have Aileen Gallagher joining us from Syracuse University. We have Andrew Lih joining us from American University. Sarah Granger joining us, author, entrepreneur, writer. Simon Owens, freelance writer, and former Media Shift editor and writer as well. So the numbers are pretty amazing when you look at what's going on in content marketing. 77% of consumer marketers are saying that they do some sort of content marketing. And they're up to 7 different social platforms where they're contributing and writing this kind of content. Outsell thinks that it's an $83.5 billion business when it comes to content marketing, and 30% of that is going to news publishers. So it's a big piece of the bottom line, potentially, for a lot of publishers. And you look at places like New York Times and Wall Street Journal and BuzzFeed and so many places that are doing content marketing, not only putting it on their websites, but also creating it, creating actual studios for content. And it also is a great opportunity in some ways for freelance journalists, for writers who are looking for extra work to add and for high-paying work. And corporate writing has always been a big thing, but now it really seems like it's taking off. Simon, we have a whole series on Media Shift, on content marketing boom this week, so you can check out that series at mediashift.org. 3 of you have written pieces for us, and so Simon, you had a whole piece just about, you've done a lot of freelance writing, you're, been a reporter in the past. What was the attraction to doing content marketing for you?
Well, I mean, part of it, and everybody will tell you this, is that it's more lucrative. As I mentioned in the piece, the average journalist makes between $40,000 and $46,000 a year, whereas with content marketing, when you're working with these corporate brands, I've seen people charge anywhere from $100 an hour to upwards of $350 an hour, which is what a mid-level attorney would charge for client work. So it's definitely more lucrative. We're also seeing just a lot of demand from the corporate space to be able to creating this content, and it happens to be happening while there's decreasing demand in the journalism world, at least demand for articles for which these journalistic outlets are actually willing to pay real money for. So a lot of journalists who may be out of work or may be struggling to find enough work to get by are seeing all this demand from the corporate side for these skill sets. And it's also not that difficult to do compared to, I used to work for U.S. News and World Report, and the amount of reporting and editing that would go into that was just tremendous. Whereas, the average article that I'm producing on behalf for a client takes me between 3 to 6 hours, and there's only kind of very minimal level of surface editing. So I'm able to complete a lot more work for a greater number of clients. So those are kind of like the baseline reasons why I think a lot of journalists are kind of crossing over into this other world.
Yeah, and I mean, we see a lot of kind of guest columns and guest posts coming into Media Shift too, and we've heard that sometimes there's this idea that you get a journalist to write a story for a client, I guess, but it's being sold to the publisher as something that's just a piece of editorial. Have you seen that before, where a client tries to get you to kind of post something or write something without disclosing that it's paid for?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it doesn't happen a lot. A lot of the corporations who are doing this, they've gone to like the inbound marketing conference. They know, they at least have a basic understanding of the ethical line. But I was just on a phone call just yesterday with a potential client over in Ireland, and we were talking about things, and he kept on saying, "Well, you could write a review for me." And I was like, "What do you mean write a review? Where would this be published?" Because I'm thinking, if I write a review of your site on your own site, that's not going to have much credits. And he's like, "Oh, you could publish it to your blog or wherever." And so I had to explain to him that that wasn't really ethical, that people who are coming to my blog, I don't want them to have to wonder if I'm writing about that topic because I was paid for. And generally, my name doesn't appear on anything, any of these content marketing pieces. It's usually ghostwritten for them. So there's not for like a CEO or an executive. So there's no, usually if my name is appearing on a bylined article, I was not paid by the brand that I'm writing about. Like at most I'm being paid by the media organization. Like, if I'm writing for MediaShift, then MediaShift pays me. But I'm not being paid by any kind of moneyed interest.
Yeah, because I know I've heard it sounds like some brands don't totally get that. Sarah, you wrote a piece about this kind of ghost blogging, ghost writing, like some of the stuff that Simon's talking about, and you found there was some good sides and bad sides. What were they?
Sure. Well, the good sides, as he was saying, are definitely the pay. It's pretty consistent work for the people who do it, and it they don't have as much of an editorial process usually. It provides ongoing work, so that's a good thing. The downsides are you can't often share what you're doing because of strict contracts in that respect. You don't get a byline, of course, and I think it's still in this little gray area where you can tell people what you do, but you can't be specific about who your clients are in many of the cases.
Yeah, I mean, and you talk about some of the execs are still obviously writing their own posts, and do you think that in a way it's a little bit of a crutch for executives or I guess thought leaders who are having other people do their writing?
Well, it is and it isn't. I think a lot of people who are out there who are business leaders are just different kinds of thinkers. They're not writers, really. And so creating content for them isn't as natural as it might be for those of us here. And so getting their thoughts across, what they'll do is they'll just tell someone, and then that person will go and make it more digestible for the masses. So while those of us who find writing easy to come by might think it's kind of a crutch or a lazy way to go, the ghostwriter, as I've talked to, they're really proud of being able to take the voices of those leaders and turn them into something that is intelligible for the people that they're working with, for their audience. Because otherwise, I think that in those cases, it wouldn't come across as clearly. And some executives, some thought leaders, obviously are very good with the written word, and it benefits them to take the time to do that if they can. But I don't think that's everybody's strong suit.
Yeah, I agree with Sarah completely. Like a lot of the CEOs that I'm writing for, they're super smart, they're super educated, they know their field really well. They're just trained writers for the web that a lot of people have wanted to consume. So I think it is valuable to be able to take their expertise, interview them on the phone, get all their main, understand their main talking points and what they want to communicate, and then as a journalist use your skills to write something that is really kind of readable and shareable, so that the maximum number of readers can get value out of it.
Yeah. And Aileen, what about the schools when it comes to content marketing? Because obviously this is becoming a big part of the market for writers and journalists. Do you think schools need to kind of put it into the curriculum in some way, or how would they teach content marketing?
I think they're uncomfortable about that idea for sure. So it's more a matter of alerting students about how their skills can be applied to different areas. And for years and years and years, we've had journalism students who go into PR, and I see it as a similar thing. This is another way to use your skills that you can make a living off of. But what's interesting is that there's some dynamic between the advertising schools that have advertising curriculums or public relations curriculums. They don't tend to mix with the journalism curriculum very much. So while in advertising they talk about, okay, what kind of campaign can we make, what kind of content marketing campaign can we make, and think about it from a strategic sense, they're not really teaching the writing, the content creation part of it either.
Yeah, so it sounds like almost both sides really need to take this on, both the advertising side and the journalism side.
I think they do, but I cannot. I think the academy would collapse if there were some sort of joint journalism advertising class. I think people are willing to kind of walk up to the line and certainly discuss it with students and tell them about it, and students are excited to hear about it. Plus, they see it, and also, honestly, the students don't care very much. It doesn't. I think generationally, it doesn't make a big difference to students or to young people in general where their content is coming from, as long as the content is good.
Yeah. What about the ethical part of it? I mean, you will teach ethics to journalists, and so it seems like that might be the place to talk about, the ethical line you walk when you're doing content marketing.
And that's certainly where we have a lot of our best conversations about it, talking about ethics, and we talk a lot about the American Society of Magazine Editors and their ethical guidelines on what was called editorial, which has changed quite a bit, actually. They just did a big change in 2015 and made it much more vague to kind of meet the market demands. But from the ethical standpoint, it just has to be clear to students that when you do this, you give up editorial control. And that's a big give. That's a big give. Anytime any client gets the right of first refusal for your work, it changes the dynamic of what you're writing.
Yeah. Andrew, do you think that's there is a place for schools when it comes to teaching and stuff, and how they can do it? I mean, it does sound like it's difficult to really change the way things are at schools.
Yeah, I think one of the main reasons why this is getting more popular, especially at the school level, is that a lot of the skills that we teach in journalism school are what folks are looking for, right? Not just the ability to take a lot of information and boil it down to something small, but in journalism school we teach about creating compelling narratives, storytelling. That's not always something you get in PR and marketing side. As I said before, you have classes about strategy, about campaigns, but in terms of writing things that make for compelling stories, that's not necessarily the strength of a lot of PR practice and PR training. So I think there's a lot of value in that the journalism side brings to it. And we had this interest in this a number of years ago. Remember Demand Media and content farms, right? So when I was teaching in Los Angeles, because Demand Media was actually headquartered in the LA area, we had a lot of our students while they were in school, doing content for Demand Media, because it was just made that much easier. You go to almost like an eBay-like board, and you can go there and sign up and do these small gigs. So I think this is something that comes back in multiple forms, and I think as long as you're transparent about it, as long as you can, positively declare conflicts of interest as you go forward, I think this is something that we're just going to see more and more of. As Simon said, the money is just a completely different category than the average journalist out there. And I remember the phrase when I was on jury duty of the judge saying, as long as something doesn't do violence to your conscience. And I think that's the kind of the guiding principle too, that if you're going to partake in this activity, make sure it doesn't do violence to your conscience, whether you take money from a firm or whether you foresee conflicts going forward with the fact that it will be disclosed at some point that you were the ghostwriter for something.
Well, I think that's a big challenge for students, that to make it clear to them that some places, if can you be out as a content marketing writer and a journalist at the same time? And Simon, it looks like you've had some luck with that, but you have to draw those lines pretty clearly. And maybe there's some places that won't hire you if that's the other kind of work that you do, or you can never write it under your byline. And that's going to be, as more journalists pick up these gigs on the side, what does that mean? What does that mean for them, and what does that mean for their careers?
Yeah, as I mentioned in my piece, like I wouldn't blame if I got a job tomorrow working for the New York Times or Forbes or Fortune or whatever. I would not blame them if they barred me from taking on any content marketing gigs, because then if you're a full-time employee, there are just too many opportunities for a conflict of interest to pop up, and that would make me less valuable as a journalist to that institution. But the content marketing stuff is more for freelancers than full-time employees. I will say one also negative that hasn't been pointed out here is now that because there's so much demand and it's where I make most of my money, I'm having less time to work on my own journalism with my own byline stuff, and that's the whole reason I got into it, because I actually love journalism. So I would say one downside is just having less and less time to write on the stuff that you actually really want to write about.
Andrew, do you think there's a little bit of a danger in journalists kind of losing journalists to content marketing if kind of some of our better writers end up doing that?
Yeah, and that's why we're trying in our journalism school, and we're trying to encourage with other journalism schools to say that, to try to get out of that traditional way that we market journalism schools, saying that if you want to be that gumshoe reporter, if you want to work for a newspaper, which just sounds so archaic these days, then you should go to journalism school. And what we want to say is go to journalism school if you believe in creating content in the public interest or knowledge in the public interest. Saying that we are interested in creating storytellers, we're interested in creating people who do compelling narratives. And I'd hope that if folks who want to be engaged in this whole content marketing side would be knowledgeable enough about it, or would go in with eyes open, saying that, I will take gigs in certain sectors, but that leaves me kind of clean in the areas where I really want to do my journalism. So if you want to do investigative journalism about environment and health and things like that, you might take a paid content marketing gig in something completely unrelated, knowing that's kind of sequestered in that world where you don't have to worry about conflicts going forward. But, that's something for each person to decide. And that's something we do need to train our journalists in, is figuring out kind of their trajectory and their career, and knowing full well when you start getting gigs in this area, they might start creating conflicts in others.
Yeah, Sarah, when you were talking to kind of these ghostwriters, did they, was it hard for them to figure out the ethics? They don't have a lot of role models to go on when it comes to these things.
Well, I think that the people that I talked to, they seem to be experienced enough in this that they weren't doing a lot of work where they had to fully pretend to be someone else by doing it. They were like one of the people that I talked to, who's a ghostwriter, said that if they asked him to write a TED Talk or something as that person, he wouldn't do that, and so he had a very clear line as to if he's writing an official piece for the company under the CEO's name, talking about some changes within the company, then that's one thing. Going and writing about from that person's personal voice is another thing. But it's kind of a strange place, because we're used to people writing speeches for other people, and that's very commonly done, and we're used to ghostwriters for autobiographies, and that's very common too. And so I think this space is still evolving, and each person has to make their own choices about what they do. But one of the points that was made that I thought was interesting is that this really reflects a lot more about the person whose name is being used than it does about the writer who is doing the writing, because that's the person who is out there saying, this is my content, when it may or may not be. How much of it was really them telling the story versus someone else writing it. And so, and as readers or as content consumers, we don't know where who wrote what and where it came from. And so it's not like everybody's going to be bookmarking or putting in footnotes in every single piece that they write, saying, disclosing, oh well, this idea came from somebody else. It just doesn't happen. So I think that we'll have to stay in this space for a while as the industry shifts, but it's, I think, becoming more prevalent and more common for these ghostwriters to be out there talking about the fact that they are ghostwriting. And a lot of the content marketing I see, most of it is not actually ghostwriting under someone else's voice. It's just writing under the company's voice. And lots of people work together writing the content, and so it doesn't make sense to put any one person's name on it in a more traditional PR way of doing things. So it's all just, I think we have to kind of take it a piece at a time and see how it evolves.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at things like these studios that are creating things like BuzzFeed. It seems to make it into art form when it comes to content marketing and things that basically look a lot like the content on BuzzFeed, but it's sponsored by someone. It's pretty obvious it's sponsored, but I don't know that people notice or care. I mean, you're nodding your head, Simon. You think they do a pretty good job?
Yeah, definitely, and I mean that's why BuzzFeed has been so successful in such a short period of time, is because they are it doesn't take long to see tons of examples of content that they've created on behalf of sponsors that has just as many views and shares as their regular content. And I think at the end of the day, I'm biased on this, but I think that they're providing a lot of value. This content is way better in quality than display advertisings and pop-ups and things that are making the web user experience worse. Also, a lot of these native advertising deals aren't based on the number of page views, and a lot of people complain that part of the reason that so many news organizations are focusing on misleading clickbait headlines, crap content, is because they're just trying to generate as many page views as possible, whereas BuzzFeed doesn't sell a single page view. So I think it'll get us off that kind of hamster wheel and allow us to focus on better content because we don't have to worry as much about driving raw traffic to the site.
Right, except that BuzzFeed still wants to get page views for its sponsored content, so it's still important for them to have that big audience too.
Sure, it wants to get a lot of page views for it, but they're not selling it on CPMs. And right. For their regular editorial content, they're not getting paid. So let's say a regular journalist at BuzzFeed who isn't working on the ad side, he's not incentivized to get a ton of traffic to his article because they're not selling CPMs against that article.
Yeah. And Jefferson has this story up by the LA Weekly, I guess, that the LA Times had an investigative story kind of looking at, with Columbia's journalism school, on Exxon's climate change research, but then at the same time they were doing an advertorial that was kind of a pro-oil campaign. Aileen, what's your thought about that, where it's like, you've got this kind of juxtaposition that's really difficult for news organizations when they go into this?
Oh, for sure. And does one hand know what the other one is doing? Who is aware that, was the editorial side aware that there was going to be a contrasting POV piece from the oil industry? And editorial and advertising, that wall has been so tall for so long, and I think even when we do branded content, we're somewhat concerned about removing the wall entirely, but when you don't talk to each other, that's what happens. And unfortunately for consumers, because everyone's getting their news through social, it's unclear where it's coming from. So is it an LA Times piece, or is it just something I read on Facebook?
Yeah, it's a good point. Andrew, what do you think about, this is something that's come up quite a lot. For this branded content, native advertising to work, it has to look like editorial. The more you kind of fool people into thinking it's editorial, the more you might get people to read it, and yet, ethically it's not it's not the nicest thing to do to your audience to basically trick them in the content that you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it just falls into the general directive for any news organization is never have your customer feel misled about anything, right? And this is one of those classic cases where, whether it is a LA Times and Staples or something else, that you should never have your audience questioning that relationship in any way, right? And it doesn't matter whether it's newspaper or digital or video. Pretty much every news organization that has ignored that advice has fallen into this problem. And as long as you respect the customer and be transparent about these things and never surprise them with these kinds of relationships, you'll be in good shape. It's not that hard, but it's tempting when you see that money pile there that could really bail out a news organization.
And to build on what Andrew was saying, Jeff Jarvis a few months ago paid for a Google consumer survey where he showed screenshots of Upworthy sponsored posts, and they said promoted on them. You and I know that promoted means that those were paid for, but he showed it to average consumers and said, "What do you think this is?" And the majority of them couldn't identify that meant that it was an ad. So I think that there are, Andrew brings up legitimate points that even when they're pretending to disclose, they're doing it in a very sly way. You notice this with Facebook, Twitter, and Google. They're not going out of their way to disclose that their native ads are ads. Like there's just a little tiny word like promoted and stuff like that. And I think that a lot of consumers aren't even really realizing that these are ads.
Yeah.
Well, and the media companies, they have to push back on the advertisers sometimes. I remember when I was starting out taking paid ads on one of the sites that I founded, a lot of the time I had to push back and said, no, your ad, the fine print is too small, or you're asking me to do this without any fine print. I won't do that. And they want, and if you don't push back, then that's what happens is everybody starts expecting you to put their content out there without any disclaimers, and so you have to be very clear about doing that.
Thanks for the discussion. It was really good. I want to thank our panel of guests, Aileen Gallagher at Syracuse University, Andrew Lih at American University, Sarah Granger, author, entrepreneur, Simon Owens, tech journalist, content marketer, and Jefferson Yen, our producer in LA. I want to thank our sponsor, NextSpace and NextKids. You can learn more about their program at nextspace.us/nextkids, and you can follow us every week at mediashift.org, on Twitter at the Mediatwits. Our episodes are on SoundCloud and YouTube. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe on iTunes and leave us a review. We'll catch you next week.